enterprise blockchains. So Cisco's been looking at this space for a couple of years now, trying to understand, just what is it? How, more importantly, do we help our customers actually understand what blockchain is? How do we get them to use it? Why would they want to use it? And we've kind of started on the journey of actually building out our own blockchain technology. No, we don't have any dates yet on general availability or anything like that just yet. But what we're really interested in understanding, from customers, partners, is just when are they ready for this kind of stuff, right? And part of the innovation cycle in general is you can't believe in something that you don't actually see, right? So in the early days when racing was happening and people didn't believe that a human being could run a 5-minute mile, right? And then people did, and then now you get 10-year-olds who are running 4-minute miles, right? And so there's something to be said about how do you actually create new things? How do you actually get new things in front of people so that they can actually understand it and then take their own path on how to actually consume this as a technology. So I'm Anup Nanra. I lead the product and go-to-market, the business effectively of Cisco Blockchain. And we're looking at this through an innovation perspective, right? This is a whole new space. Yes, the technology is roughly 10 years old, but fundamentally it's still a nascent space. The impact and application to business is still being discovered. People are still trying to understand what this actually is and how do they move it forward. So what we'll do today, a couple of things that we won't be covering, right? Won't be covering, what sets the price of Bitcoin. That's not the objective. We're here talking about enterprise blockchains. And we'll talk about, kind of the brief history to kind of level set everybody, the brief history on what blockchain is. We'll talk about some of the emerging use cases that we've seen over the last couple of years. We'll talk about what we've been doing on blockchain and then a little bit about the future. So, like with all other sessions, fill in your feedback, comments. We'll have a dialogue on WebEx Teams. We always want to hear feedback. Any questions folks have, if something wasn't clear, or if there was something that you want to have a continued discussion on, let's get it into the WebEx Teams, and we'll have that discussion there. So what we're not going to cover today, right? So as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to talk about the hike and the drop of Bitcoin price. We won't be talking about the hype that has surrounded cryptocurrencies, ICOs. Those are interesting phenomenon. There's definitely something there, but when it comes to enterprises, when it comes to how do you relate blockchain to IT and networking and infrastructure, there's a different perspective that needs to be had, right? And we're seeing over the last couple of years, certainly, that out of the innovation that came from Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper on trying to solve the double spend problem in the cryptocurrency world, out of that is emerging an enterprise spin to blockchain initiatives. Certainly there's been a massive run-up in terms of investments in this area. Again, we won't be covering that in great detail. And we won't be talking about the things where a company selling Long Island iced tea as an example attaches blockchain to their name and then drives the price up of their stock, right? I think those days are long gone. Being able to say that you're now taking advantage of a new technology to transform your business and driving up excitement around your company, I think those days are long gone. I think what people are looking at now is how do you actually extract real critical value by adopting this new and innovative technology? And we won't be talking about CryptoKitties. So who knows about CryptoKitties? Quick show of hands. Okay, so some of you guys lied because some of you said you didn't know anything about blockchain. CryptoKitties. CryptoKitties, I really do like CryptoKitties. One, not just because it's an economic framework around ownership and monetization around digital assets, but it proved to this space and it proved to the industry that you could actually make blockchain simple to understand, simple to interact with. Through a mobile or a simple desktop experience, you can actually integrate and take part in a blockchain experience, right? Now, the valuation of some of these upgrades and add-ons to your CryptoKitty, I won't go into details of how those evaluations came about because, frankly, I don't understand. But, hundreds of thousands of dollars have been sold. There have been millions of dollars spent on CryptoKitties. But how does that affect you and your enterprise, right? It probably doesn't, right? So we won't cover that today. So what we will talk about is a brief history. Why, starting back in around 2014, 2015, where the big banks, why were they looking at blockchain technology? Why were they looking at cryptocurrencies? Why were they trying to understand how this as a technology changes the way they do business? How does it, in some cases, disintermediate their function, their role, right? Because what the technology is, in theory, poised to do is basically take a lot of business process that middlemen execute between institutions and automate that, right? Automate that. You've got shared business process. You've got something like accounts payable, accounts receivable, right? Two separate functions, two separate organizations, enterprises who are running a shared business process. You order something gets built, it gets delivered, you get paid for it, right? In a lot of the early days, there was a lot of talk about the application of blockchain in things like clearing and settlement, right? So the folks in here who are from, have a financial background, clearing and settlement has classically been the holy grail of blockchain use case, right? To take a stock trade and settle it in near real time. That's what a lot of the excitement in the early days blockchain has, it was being positioned as doing. The challenge there is that the exchanges already technically can do real-time clearing and settlement. The market structure doesn't permit it though, right? So what is the real application of the technology in that sense? So what we'll start doing is looking at fundamentally what are the drivers around enterprise blockchain. We're seeing a lot of innovation happening, new classes of networks being created, right? Onset of things like 5G. Well, blockchain is technically a new class of network, right? It's coined as a value network, right? Where the objects and the assets that exist within the network have direct and immediate value. There's ownership that's attached to those assets, right? And you're creating an environment where these assets can be moved around, right? You can change ownership, you can change custody. We're seeing new business models emerge as a result of this, right? So not only are we looking at this as new assets, new methods of monetizing those assets, right, are starting to emerge now. So a lot of financial institutions are now looking at this through the lens of, is there a new line of revenue that can be created out of either managing these assets, custodianship of the cryptographic keys attached with these assets, right? So there's new business models that can be had. There's new top-line revenue that can be created. We're seeing a lot of advancements in technologies just within the blockchain stack itself. So everything from new and innovative ledger technologies to consensus mechanisms, the model by which the network actually achieves agreement on the state of an object or an asset, to even the codification of business process, so-called smart contracts. How do you codify a business process and implement it and execute it across an entire business network, right, in a distributed fashion, right? So lots of innovative technology, lots of advancements to, frankly, in some cases, some old ideas, right? I mean, cryptocurrency is not a new concept. Cryptocurrencies have been around since the 90s. Those iterations failed because they were centrally managed, centrally issued, centrally governed, right? So from a hacker's perspective, you've only got one point of attack to go to, right? You only got one database to go and manipulate. And if the operator of that enterprise who manages those crypto assets doesn't adhere to best practices on security, infrastructure, managing their infrastructure, then being able to compromise the database that hosts and houses all of these assets can be easily compromised. And of course, we're seeing the days of customers consuming resources from multiple endpoints, multiple clouds, right? So being able to support an application framework where you can't force, a customer or part of their ecosystem or their entire ecosystem to use just one infrastructure. You got to be able to support multiple operating environments, right? These are the things that we're starting to see as what is driving the interest around blockchain. So when we first started, the very first comments that we got when we talked to, some of the, less mature financial institutions, insurance companies, manufacturing facilities is, why would I want Bitcoin in my network, right? We're saying, as Cisco, as an enterprise networking, as a networking infrastructure provider, we're now looking at blockchain technology. Well, the association to Bitcoin and all the nefarious acts that were associated with Bitcoin in those early days, this was the comment. Why would I want Bitcoin in my network, right? So going back, even as recent as 4 or 5 years, there was still not enough awareness around the application of the underlying technology and its application to enterprise. And so we started the journey of actually starting to educate customers, right? What is the difference between cryptocurrencies, digital currencies, and the application of the underlying technology in the enterprise? Question always came up was, what is the right data model for enterprises? Cryptocurrencies are, they have a very unique and interesting data model, basically, who touched it last and who has current ownership and some associated value to that asset. The question becomes is, in the enterprise, is that good enough, right? And if it's not good enough, then how do you build an asset model or an object model that is really relevant to the business, right? It's not a simple key value pair that represents, an asset that might live someplace else. How do you actually get to something that is actually meaningful to an enterprise? Something that actually relates to the purpose and the function of the application of the technology. There was still a lot of confusion in the early days between permissioned and public networks. So if you're familiar with Bitcoin, Bitcoin is the largest public blockchain network. You don't have to have identity attached to it, right? Any individual randomly can attach themselves to this network, interact with it, right? Get ownership of assets, transfer ownership of assets. You don't really know who you're dealing business with. In an enterprise context, particularly in financial services, you have to know who you're doing business with, right? And so the idea that a free-for-all network in the enterprise context just doesn't seem to work, at least not yet. There's still innovation that's happening. And so the model that's emerging, certainly from the enterprise, is how do you look at permissioned networks, right? So it's a network, it's a blockchain network, everything is distributed, shared business process. You've got interactions around assets, but there's a strong identity attached to anyone and everyone who's attached. Not just individuals, potentially machines, and certainly the registration of enterprises. So any entity. At its core, blockchain is a cryptographically secure version of truth that is shared across an ecosystem, right? So what does that mean, right? You've got a piece of information that you've deemed as an enterprise that is critical to share knowledge of that information across your ecosystem. And you've got a piece of knowledge that people can attribute information to, right? So you've got an object that's, let's say I've got a purchase order for a bunch of products. In the supply chain context, that sends signals all the way up and down from how the raw components of that are financed to how and when your downstream manufacturers start procuring raw materials, convert those into finished goods to be converted into a product that is then registered, has been registered against a purchase order. That purchase order is an object that could live in a blockchain network. So it's a version of truth that the rest of your ecosystem depends on, right? The creation of this purchase order sends signals up and down a supply chain ecosystem. That information is critical to share because if you look at it from our perspective, that is the event that causes us to create products and have them built and delivered to customers. So because it's shared, because this is a shared piece of infrastructure, shared data, you have to know whether or not everyone is receiving that information, has not manipulated it in any way, right? And if they haven't manipulated it, then the trust in that information goes up. So the more people sharing this information, and the more people who are proving that they are maintaining and recording it faithfully, the more trust you have in that information. So, but how do you get there? How do you go from shared information to shared and trusted data across an operating network like this? Well, very, very quickly, how does distributed ledger technologies and fundamentally the core of blockchain work, right? So let's say you've got a piece of information. Piece of information that has, let's say that this is a purchase order. Any event that results in the creation of that purchase order is captured and is replicated across the entire network. And this is an active business network, right? So as an active business network, not only as an individual, an enterprise with a node that sits on this network, am I presenting my purchase order information, but I'm also receiving transactions from other enterprises doing their own business as well. May not have anything to do with my purchase order. So you've got nodes that are participating in transactions, and these transactions are replicated across the entire network. And at a certain point in time, right, as everyone is collecting all these transactions, and everyone should, in fact, be seeing the exact same set of transactions, at a certain point in time, a block is created. This block is the history of transactions in the right order, sequentially managed. It's a list of transactions for a given period of time. At a certain point in time, someone will randomly say, this is the list of transactions that I have. And this list is represented by this hash value. Does this hash value align with the hash value that everyone else in the network has, right? So I'm going to take a number that I've got, and I'm going to say, this is the number representing my list of transactions in a given period of time. Does it agree with everybody else's list of transactions, and therefore they should get to the exact same hash value? If there is agreement, right, that hash value does in fact align, that everyone has a hash value that ends in 6IC4, consensus is achieved, that block of transactions is cryptographically signed and cryptographically linked to the preceding block of transaction history. Everyone does this exact same function, more or less at the exact same time. The beauty and the power of blockchain here is that this list of transactions, this list of blocks of transactions, everyone's maintaining a copy of that. Everyone in the network should have the exact same piece of historical information. Now, from a hacker's perspective, and this is where the real power comes in, from a hacker's perspective, if I want to manipulate a transaction in, say, the middle block, and that transaction is in block 250,000 out of 500,000 blocks, and I've got 10,000 ecosystem members, 10,000 nodes on this network. As a hacker, I will have to cryptographically compromise 249,499 blocks to get to the block of interest, and do that at the exact same time concurrently across all 10,000 nodes. So from a cybersecurity perspective, very difficult to actually go in and manipulate a single transaction. And that's the power, right, of the technology. There is a known version of truth that is exactly the same and cryptographically proven to be exact same across the entire network. And so using these insights around trusted data, right? Data that can't be manipulated, it's immutable now. You know, we're seeing opportunities around driving automation around business process. We're starting to see the emergence of some companies being disintermediated. That no one's actually been disintermediated yet, but a lot of companies are starting to look at how do they transform their business because they know that their current business is probably going to disappear in 3 to 5 years' time, right? So it's driving digital transformation at the same time. And of course, securitized digital assets, right? So even though we're not talking about cryptocurrencies here, there is a model emerging around taking data that you would have classically and normally thrown away from an operating environment, packaging it, and turning it into a monetizable asset. Right? And I'll describe some of that a little later. And of course, coming with this, you know, we're seeing changes in IT architectures, right? Going from client-server architectures to fully decentralized architectures where all data is replicated across these different environments, different domains, different networks, and indeed across different enterprises. So if you look at blockchain today, you look at DLT today, and you know, where is it having its impact, right? In general, what we're seeing is a lot of very interesting projects going after very specific use cases in various industries that are proving value of the technology, proving value that immutability of data sets can bring, right? Proving value of the integrity, you know, in automating integrity of that data, showing that, you know, there is value in this technology. However, our observation is that doesn't go far enough, and I'll describe a little bit more about that a little later. However, there is good work happening here. I don't want to discount any of it, right? But this is a market that is still being created. It's still nascent. And so the opportunities are still out there to be had. So fundamentally, from an enterprise perspective, 3 key themes have consistently emerged. How do we increase transparency across an ecosystem, right? Remember I described, we've got this shared data model thing that's happening, right? You got a piece of information that is being cryptographically replicated across an ecosystem of participants, right? It's a piece of information that cannot be shared, or sorry, that cannot be changed. It can't be compromised once it's in the network, right? So driving transparency around data, data access, data quality, data availability, you know, these are things that are driving the investments and have successfully driven the investments in blockchain space. Looking at complexity, a lot of enterprises are trying to figure out how do they take their very time-consuming, labor-intensive business processes and simplify them, right? So if you look at clearing and settlement, right, in the financial services area, right, as I said earlier, a lot of really good technology already exists. You can already do real-time clearing and settlement of stock transactions. However, when a stock transaction fails, and they do fail from time to time, there is an army of NBAs that get enacted on both the buy and sell side to figure out where, when, and for how long, and why did that transaction fail, right? A number of years ago, Goldman Sachs posted that they estimated roughly $400 million is spent annually trying to figure out why stock transactions fail, right? So how do you drive simplicity? How do you stamp out complexity? And of course, security. There is still a misnomer in the blockchain space that if I introduce blockchain into my environment, I'm now secure. Well, that's just not right. Technically, that's incorrect. You have data immutability. You have a piece of information that can't be manipulated. However, if you were to compromise the business application that is posting data to your blockchain network, blockchain doesn't help you identify that, right? It doesn't help you, it doesn't prevent you from accidentally posting information that should not have been posted, right? So you still, as an enterprise, even though enterprises are starting to look at blockchain, adopting blockchain, turning out products based on blockchain, you still have to adhere to best practices around security of your information, of your data, of your infrastructure in order to actually extract the full value of blockchain technology. So emerging use cases. So we've spent quite a bit of time looking at a wide variety of use cases. And this is a list that, it's one of these lists where the instant you post it, it's obsolete, right? And so obviously a number of years ago, a lot of activity, a lot of excitement around financial services, right? Everything from private equities to syndicated lending, mortgages, asset-backed securities, microfinancing, microloans, a lot of really good use cases where there is an incentive and there is a need to share information across an ecosystem of business participants where this data, where data just needs to be available, right? If you look at syndicated lending as an example, right? Syndicated lending is a model where, if let's say I'm a big shipping company and I want to build a fleet of billion-dollar ships, and I go to my favorite bank, we've had a long-standing relationship, and I go to the bank and say, I need $6 billion to go off and build, a fleet of ships. That bank will turn around and say, yeah, we have a good history. You make due on your payments. We do business well. But that bank will not take on all the risk. That bank will not reach into its pockets and give you $6 billion. What that bank will do is say, I'm going to create an investment portfolio where a number of investors can participate in the creation of a $6 billion debt instrument, and that is the syndicate of investors. So everyone gets a piece of the action. My favorite bank that I go to has effectively de-risked themselves from actually taking on that kind of a debt burden and spread it across an ecosystem. So here's the challenge. Here's why blockchain was of interest in that use case. As the deal is being created, as this debt instrument is being created, there's a lot of due diligence. There's a lot of data that goes back and forth across different participants. As this data goes back and forth between different participants, some people may be annotating, some people may be changing slight terms to be compliant with their own internal corporate covenances. There's always data that is in flux. Blockchain is being seen as applying a model of data integrity and data immutability and synchronization, most importantly, of all this data that is in flux. So everyone, at any moment in time, when they look at their ledger that's attached to this blockchain network, they're guaranteed to be looking at the exact same piece of information that everyone else is doing, right? So it takes out some of the challenges around closing a deal, but then later realizing that the terms of that deal are not compliant to your own business needs, right? So syndicated lending has been a very, very popular use case to go after. And we're starting to see the emergence of IoT use cases, right? The application to connected and smart vehicles, smart charging, electric like parking garages, even are now being enabled with blockchain technologies. And governments are taking note. Public records around real estate ownership, title of your home, your business, registration of your licenses. There's a lot of countries around the world that are moving very quickly on digitization and digitizing their infrastructure that citizens use and doing it on blockchain. So let's take a look at IoT. Did I go too ahead or? Okay. Internet of Things, right? So we've got, you know, a connected manufacturing floor. That connected manufacturing floor, let's take the Cisco context, that's a floor that we don't own, right? Cisco doesn't manufacture its own stuff. We outsource that, right? So let's just say that this is a machine that is generating parts for one of our appliances. It's completely outsourced. How that finished part goes from the factory floor to our customer, even that is completely outsourced. How we go from, you know, taking that finished product, delivering it, doing maintenance, the maintenance piece we do, right? But the genesis of that appliance is a completely outsourced event, a complete outsourced transaction. So one of the use cases that we're now starting to see is how do we get efficacy in the manufacture of components that may be in one of these boxes? With what quality, right? It's the quality that we're trying to get to. What allows us to determine quality of that part, of that component, of that finished appliance? Well, if we had access to all transaction history around maintenance, repair, software, firmware, around that machine, now I've got attributed data that I can attach or have attached to the creation of an object that could be a part that goes into an appliance. And I have information that is now being shared across an ecosystem, right? So maintenance history, you know, let's say it's a third party, you know, let's say that this machine is leased by the manufacturer. The company that manufactures this machine would want to know, is the operator actually doing the maintenance, or has that maintenance actually been outsourced back to the manufacturer? As a consumer, as a customer of this, I want to be able to determine what is the quality and what is the projected yield of the finished goods that are coming off this assembly line. If I can get that, if I ever have a recall for whatever reason, I can go down to the machine level. I can go down and figure out which individuals interacted with that machine in seconds, right? A recall today, on average, takes days to weeks to do a full root cause analysis on. In a blockchain environment, it's done in seconds. So the cost, the brand reputation hit, right, is dramatically reduced. We're seeing applications in machine-to-machine economy. This one is still a little bit further out, but we're starting to see this emerge. We're starting to see data markets emerge as a result of interaction of electric and autonomous vehicles, the data that they generate, the monetization of that data, and the interaction with, say, smart parking garages, right? We're starting to see payment vendors start looking at this as a technology. Certainly, there are, you know, Visa, MasterCard are examples of companies that are investing in machine-to-machine economy today, right? If you ever take a look at, take a trip out to Singapore and visit their innovations, MasterCard's innovation center there, you will see this actually happening. You will see blockchain-enabled machine-to-machine, human-to-machine interaction taking place, cataloged, recorded on blockchain environment. So this is starting to happen, right? What we need, where we need to get to, is a global level of performance. Right? How do we get to a trusted transaction layer for these kinds of transactions at a global scale? Maybe not one network, maybe not two networks, maybe a collection of networks actually facilitating this with performance, with scale, with security. And I talked briefly about, you know, supply chain just a second ago, right? And as we looked at supply chain, as we looked at, a couple of years ago, we looked at, well, how do we actually consume this technology, right? How do we take advantage of this? Where could we take advantages? Where are those cost centers where we are dependent on the efficient operation of a business ecosystem? And how do we actually introduce blockchain to drive simplicity across our ecosystem, take out cost, manage risk, potentially create net new monetization models? And so we actually rolled out Cisco blockchain technology that we built across our Cisco supply chain ecosystem. Today, we're operating a global network that is tracking around 300 million assets globally in real time around the world right now. What we didn't realize as we went down this journey is that Cisco is actually ranked number 3 in the world for supply chain efficiency. Yet, there's always room for improvement, right? So one of the questions we had was, if we're so good at supply chain, is it even feasible from a business perspective to even consider the application of blockchain technology? So we've been running this network for a while, and what we're very proud of the fact that we're now actually able to seize gray market and counterfeit assets before they get to our customers, right? So we are digitally capturing the genesis, the point of manufacture of an asset, tracking it through its life cycle, right? And registering all these interactions with that asset on our ledger. From a customer's perspective, from a customs perspective, from a distributor's perspective, or anyone for that matter within our ecosystem, they can now simply take a shipment, scan it, and in seconds have a verification of whether or not it's a genuine artifact, right? Now, because we're just leveraging security labels and whatnot, there is always the question, well, what if someone just copied your label, copied your artifact that you were looking at that allows you to identify whether or not something is genuine or not? Well, what we make available then is the complete genealogy and chain of custody, right, of that object. So if you're a customs agent and you're in Port of Houston and you get a shipment and it looks kind of wonky, you scan it, and either you'll say, yep, this is legit, or you'll say, no, this is suspicious, and here's the chain of custody associated with this asset. If you're in Houston and the last registered event is that this is a device that has been deployed at a customer in Berlin, one of these two is suspect, right? So now from our brand protection perspective, the guys who actually go out and investigate these things, they have a very clear course of action to take. They don't have to spend months investigating, right? They know that within the next day, they can make a call or book a flight to go to one of two locations to actually start the root cause analysis of this artifact. So that's how we've been kind of using the technology. Now, what I'll start talking about now is a glimpse to the future, right? So we've rolled this out. We're kind of kicking the tires on it. We're understanding the application, the value. I used to be a Cisco customer, right? And I would always ask, well, if it's not good enough for Cisco, why would it be good enough for me, right? So we're starting to address some of these questions, right? There's something there. There's something of value. We're proving the value, but could we do more, right, is the question. So how are we looking at blockchain moving forward, right? So we've built this application stack. This application is a set of software that gets replicated across a bunch of nodes. These nodes then turn into blockchain infrastructure. This blockchain infrastructure is now communicating amongst itself, sharing transaction events, sharing history of assets, replicating it, all that information in such a way that it can't be modified, can't be manipulated in the future. But the way that we look at blockchain is we need for this space to, in order for it to become kind of mainstream, we're interested in identifying what are the common standards, what are common protocols, what's the basic layer that will allow us to get to an environment where we can do network of networks. The fact that you can actually connect different operating environments, different industries together, right? Create orthogonal relationships between different industries, potentially create new monetizable assets as a result. That's what has us excited about blockchain in the enterprise. So one of the examples of something that we're now starting to see as a result of this network of networks model, right? And it's not just technical networks, it's business networks that are now being interacted with, right, and being connected, is we're starting to see energy, renewable energy, right? So you take a solar energy farm, right? And a solar energy farm is a collection of solar panels. They're on motors, there's sensors to, correctly position the panel so that it's generating the maximum yield, maximum energy. In the classic sense, for a certain number of hours of direct sunlight, there's a certain amount of energy produced. There's a certificate that is issued that says over a course of a period of, let's say, 8 hours, 10 or 12 kilowatts of energy was created, right? So that's a thing that exists today, right? That's not new. What is new is, one, there seems to be interest in taking these certificates and putting them on directly on an energy market, right? Directly and in real time. But also, interestingly, we're now seeing interest in capturing the IoT operational data, right? So, as I described, you got a solar panel that is being moved across, being rotated, so it's constantly in generating the getting maximum sunlight, generating the maximum amount of power. Well, did the panel track the sun accurately in real time? Was there a delay, right? Were there infrastructure transactions, command and control signals that were sent that were not acted upon, right? Essentially, what is the quality of the generated energy certificate, right? So what we're starting to see now is this kind of operational data being attributed to an energy certificate. So if you've got two certificates and they both say 8 kilowatts, but one was generated over a 2-hour period because the infrastructure is efficiently operated, and the other one was 8 kilowatts over a 12-hour period because that infrastructure is not efficiently operated, which one do you think would be worth more, right? And so we're starting to see some of this operational data be turned into asset-backed securities and put onto a secondary market on exchanges. But fundamentally, what we're seeing as a result of that is a need to drive simplicity in how do you operationalize, how do you manage, how do you stand up blockchain infrastructures, right? Blockchain is still a very complicated topic, right? It's still, people still are trying to figure out, well, I've got this blockchain thing now, how do I integrate it into my IT system? How do I integrate it into my operational system, right? It's blockchain, right? It does one thing. It just does data immutability. It doesn't do anything else other than that. How do you make it secure? We have proven through our work with our partners in the security team, you can actually compromise blockchain networks, right? You don't necessarily have to attack the blockchains directly, but if you attack the underlying infrastructure, you can bring the business network of a blockchain down, right? Compromising DNS, compromising BGP, the things that we know best on how to secure, how to manage, how to deploy. These are still weak points within a blockchain environment, and they had not really been considered as part of the puzzle. But our perspective is that this has to be part of the puzzle and how you actually stand up and operationalize blockchain networks, and of course scalability. How do you get true performance? How do you get internet scale performance? So as we've kind of been looking at blockchain technology, we've been trying to figure out, okay, well, how would we deploy the technology? Certainly we've deployed it within our supply chain ecosystem. We learned a lot. And some of the insights that we got out of that was you have to prove that no one can take control of the network, that no one can take control of either onboarding new participants, the life cycle management of how you take enterprises, get them on board, how do you take individuals, get them on board, how do you manage the creation of these networks. You have to be able to prove and instantiate new models of data access and data control. Remember, this is data that is now being shared across an ecosystem. And in our observation, working with our supply chain partners, one of the things that we realized is that privacy confidentiality is still critically needed. So even though we're sharing information, we don't need to share all information at all time. It needs to be accessible, it needs to be available for those who need it. And part of that resistance, or part of that insight was our ecosystem is changing all the time. We get new partners, we get new suppliers, new vendors, some people go, right? So if there's churn within your ecosystem and you've instantiated a blockchain transaction layer between all these parties, and you establish a set of private transactions, when there's churn in your ecosystem, what happens to all that data privacy? Right? Because at one point in time, these partners had access. When they leave, do they still have access? Right? So privacy confidentiality in a high churn environment is still very, very important, right? And it's something that has, for the longest time, blockchain industry has struggled with. So speeding up a bit, right? So what do enterprises actually need? So in part of our journey on trying to make blockchain simple, right? There's work to be done in this space to actually make it simple to build with, simple to operate. So one of the things that we've done is we've actually adopted an object-based blockchain ledger. And as an object-based ledger, we treat it just like any other database, right? So from a business applications perspective, you don't really have to know that there's blockchain underneath, right? It's just a new class of data store. It's the data store that has immutability of shared business process and shared data, business data, across an ecosystem. We've gone through a lot of effort to natively integrate with LDAP, right? So what does that mean? One of the biggest challenges that exists in blockchain today is how do you actually establish roles and responsibilities of actually executing business applications in a shared business environment, and how do you ensure data access policies are enforced, right? So you got roles and responsibilities. Someone with a lower level of access has access to only a certain amount of information. Someone with elevated roles has access to more information, right? How do you manage data access in a shared data environment, especially when you have something as complex as an object-based ledger? So what we've done is we've effectively federated LDAP across the ledger. We look at native LDAP interfaces that most IT businesses and IT systems run, and you plug in. At the ends, the ledger takes care of the mapping of all the roles and responsibilities, right? So effectively, you don't have to spend a lot of time mapping roles and responsibilities of individuals, organizations across these disparate enterprises. That's mapped out, so long as you're adhering to best practices of managing and identifying roles and responsibilities that are kind of LDAP, right? This is taken care of. You should still verify, right, all that capability, right, and verify that the mapping is actually done correctly. But this is something that we've actually done. We've actually federated LDAP as a result. And so looking a little bit further, right? So what is actually impeding the adoption of enterprise blockchain, right? It's been a couple of years now, 10 years since the original paper and code was released. We're seeing a lot of good press releases, a lot of good projects, a lot of what should be, full-on large-scale adoption, right, of this technology. It hasn't happened yet. And part of it, our belief, is that enterprises need more than just data integrity, data immutability that is afforded by blockchain and ledger technologies. They need to have instrumentation. You need to have the ability to know what is the quality of your ledger. Not just your node, but what is the quality of your ledger and therefore your shared and distributed business framework, right? What is the health of your ecosystem, essentially? So if you've got ecosystem partners that are continually, for whatever reason, sending in bad data, right, either maliciously or they just have bad data, how do you identify that? What is the impact of that enterprise, that organization, on the rest of your business network, right? What is the instrumentation with the meters that we can put in place? Also, one of the challenges that still exists within the blockchain space is how do you actually operationalize this in a completely heterogeneous fashion? On-prem, in the cloud, colo facilities, right? We're not forcing anybody to say, you have to deploy on this, that, or the other. You say, you deploy it wherever you want. You can help facilitate it, right? Facilitate the management, facilitate the orchestration, the actual instantiation of the ledger itself. But customers need the freedom to be able to deploy where they want. So that's all well and good, right? And so we've been actually building out this technology, building out an actual blockchain platform. It's a modular architecture. We're founding members of the Hyperledger project. This follows the Hyperledger architecture almost verbatim, right? Orchestration, identity, policy, smart contracts, the ledger storage itself, consensus mechanisms, complete plug and play of consensus, the process by which the network achieves agreement. One of the areas where we've put a lot of effort is in that quality question, right? How do you determine the quality of the business network, the business framework? So we have instrumentation from the smart contracts all the way down to the infrastructure to determine the health of not only a blockchain node that would exist on-prem at a customer's site or exists as a virtual appliance in their choice of cloud provider, but what is the health of the blockchain network as a whole, right? So real-time analytics and telemetry of both performance and applications across the entire network. And of course, we're spending a lot of time around privacy confidentiality, right? How do we actually ensure privacy and confidentiality at scale in a high churn environment? So a little bit of long-term perspective, right? And some of this will be a summary of kind of a couple of slides that just preceded, right? Enterprises need the ability and the assurance that no one element, no one entity, organization can take control or compromise their network. Fine-grained access controls. This is a big gap in this space today. We're starting to see some emerging and promising projects that addresses this, right? But this is going to be a make or break for this space, I believe. Predictive threat analytics and collusion control. Again, how do you determine the health and the quality of your network, right? Getting to internet scale, getting to well beyond thousands of transactions. I mean, thousands of transactions is almost laughable these days, right? It's got to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of transactions per second. That's where we need to get to. The state of the art, depending on what you read, is on average between 1,000 and 10,000 transactions per second. Certainly not enough to say go and be any serious competition to someone like Visa or MasterCard, right? But if we're talking about machine-to-machine economy down the road, 10,000 transactions per second is simply not going to be enough, so we need more. So some of the gaps, right? So at a high level, we've got things like data privacy, security. But what is actually needed? Let's double click behind those, right? So things like, performance management, being able to throttle data throughout the network, throughout the ecosystem. Things like being able to integrate natively with a, developer toolkit, right? I used to be a developer. I used to be a customer. No vendor could come in and tell me what tools I should or shouldn't be using. I'm going to use what I'm going to use based on my business needs, right? So being able to plug in natively into an existing developer environment is going to be critical. How do we streamline the user experience, not just from an ops perspective, but even from a developer's perspective? We need the ability for anyone to really go off and innovate in this space. And so there's also a number of Cisco products that are also being, bundled into this, right? So we look at Cisco DNA, right? From orchestration management, getting telemetry, being able to manage this across multiple infrastructures, leveraging the best-in-class Cisco security that we have, right? As I said earlier, you need to have end-to-end security, right? Blockchain just says your data is now immutable. That's it, right? And you can do some interesting smart contract work on top to basically determine where and how and when that data can be interacted with, manipulated, what have you, right? But at the end of the day, you still need best practices of end-to-end security, right? And so we're starting to integrate some of those assets into our stack. And where we're getting to, and hopefully if you spend some time down in the world of solutions, in the Innovation Pavilion, you will see a prototype of what we believe is the first network-embedded, network-integrated digital ledger technology. So digital ledger technology not running in a compute appliance or just in the cloud, but actually running in switching and routing, right? So our belief is that we will take certain functionality over time and make them native to switching and routing. First-class native elements. And it is by going that route, we believe that we are actually going to be able to drive true world-scale performance on blockchain. So what are the use cases? I've only got a minute left. So what are the use cases of now you're taking blockchain technology and putting it in the infrastructure? Enterprise management of infrastructure, right? Service provider, mobile networks, 5G, IoT, being able to take ledger technology straight to the edge, right? Integrating it into the radio infrastructure. Now all transactions that go across your radio infrastructure can become trusted transactions, right? Being able to do SD-WAN, being able to guarantee delivery of resources, of shared resources, right? That's going to be pretty powerful, right? Certainly if you look at, where service providers are evolving to, right? How do you repackage and make available infrastructure and investments they already have and make that available into new customers? And of course, a little bit of what you'll see downstairs is blockchain infrastructure in the network starting to enable things like IoT, energy, SD-WAN, SP mobility, smart cities, and retail, right? Start to see some of these as prototypes downstairs. What that means on how we actually take DLT or blockchain technology into the rest of the infrastructure, the rest of our assets, how do we integrate as a common back end potentially, right? How do we provide efficacy of operations from an IT perspective, end to end, from the core all the way to the edge? How do we look at attributes of data that we're now collecting from this ledger technology that is infrastructure focused. How do we do real-time continuous audit and compliance of infrastructure in a shared environment, right? A regulated environment, healthcare, financial services. You've got business applications that are being impacted by infrastructure configuration and provisioning, and potentially penalties associated with any violations of compliance issues. Sell that into an insurance industry, potentially, right? There's some really interesting artifacts that can emerge. And to wrap it up, when we first started looking at this space, customers were saying, why would I want Bitcoin in my network? 5 years on, 4.5, 5 years on, now they're saying, I can automate accountability. That's powerful. Automate accountability in a shared business environment. There's a lot to be had here, right? And of course, I would say my recommendation is get involved, get educated on this space, join Hyperledger, join the Trusted IoT Alliance. I'm the co-founder and chairman of that. Join the Chamber of Commerce if you're interested in what's happening from an SEC perspective, from a government perspective. Join the Chamber of Commerce. And if you're here the rest of the week, we have more sessions on blockchain, some IoT. We'll do some deep dives on IoT and infrastructure tomorrow. And we have some stuff going on smart contracts. Sure. All right. That's it. Fill out your sessions, reviews, get on WebEx Teams. We'll have a conversation.